until a song began to rise from a ruined cathedral. No one knew who sang it or what it wanted. The voices had no bodies, only echoes that promised salvation. Each night, survivors gathered to listen, and each night, one of them vanished. Was the choir a miracle or a curse disguised as faith? This is the choir that sang after the world ended, where the last song on earth might not be sung by the living. The world had ended in a silence so complete that even the wind seemed reluctant to stir the dust that choked the skeletal remains of cities. Yet here, in this shattered cathedral, a sound rose each night, a choir singing without bodies, their voices threading through the broken stone, like ghosts weaving a fragile tapestry of hope and dread. I remember the first time I crossed the threshold of this ruined sanctuary. The heavy oak doors, swollen and cracked, groaned under my hand as I pushed them open, revealing a vast hollow inside. Moonlight spilled through the fragmented stained glass, casting fractured shards of color that danced across the broken pews and the cracked stone floor. The air was thick with the scent of decay and cold stone, but beneath that lay something more elusive, a whisper of something sacred, or perhaps profane. Survivors had gathered before me, their faces pale in the dim light, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and yearning. Mara was among them, her slender figure huddled near the altar, her pale hands clutching a worn piece of cloth from her tattered coat. Her eyes reflected the faint glow of the flickering flame from a makeshift lantern, haunting and ethereal. Elias stood nearby, his stocky frame rigid, scars marring his weathered face. He scanned the shadows with a soldier's vigilance, distrust etched deeply in his furrowed brow. The first notes of the choir's hymn began not with a sound but a vibration, a subtle tremor that stirred the dust motes in the stagnant air. Then the voices emerged, a cascade of ethereal tones, harmonizing without a visible source. It was as if the very stones of the cathedral were singing, ancient and sorrowful. The melody was haunting, beautiful in its sorrow, a siren call that wrapped around our hearts and tugged at the fragile threads of hope we clung to. Mara closed her eyes and began to hum softly, her voice trembling as she joined the invisible chorus. Elias's eyes darkened with unease, his hands tightening into fists. He muttered something about illusions and dangers, but his words were swallowed by the swelling hymn. I stood amid them, feeling the weight of the cathedral's silence and its song pressing down on my soul. Questions churned beneath my ribs. Who or what was this choir? Were they angels of mercy or something far more sinister? The ruins around us whispered secrets I could not yet decipher, and the choir's melody seemed to hold both salvation and doom in its haunting embrace. As the last note faded, leaving a heavy silence that pressed against our chests, the survivors exchanged uncertain glances. The fragile hope that had drawn us together flickered, uncertain but undimmed. I felt it too, a tentative thread of something beyond despair, tangled with the sharp thorns of fear. That night, beneath the shattered vaults of a fallen world, I began to understand that this choir was more than a sound. It was a force, a living hymn that would shape our fate in ways none of us could yet imagine. And so, with wary steps and a heart full of questions, I took my place among the shadows, ready to listen and to learn what secrets the choir might sing to those brave enough to hear. Night after night, the shattered remnants of the cathedral echoed with a sound that was both otherworldly and comfortingly familiar. The choir's hymn drifted through the vaulted ruins, an ethereal cascade of voices that seemed to rise from the very stones beneath our feet. I sat among the survivors, our ragged forms huddled in broken pews, the flickering glow of scattered candles casting long shadows across our worn faces. Mara, slender and pale, sat close to the center, her haunting eyes closed as she softly sang along with the choir. Her voice, fragile but fervent, wove itself into the melody like a thread of hope stitched through the cold fabric of our fractured world. Nearby, Elias stood watch, his stocky frame tense, arms crossed over a scarred chest. His eyes never left Mara, a silent sentinel guarding faith from faltering into folly. The cathedral's broken, stained glass filtered the moonlight, splintering it into shards of color that danced across the cracked stone floor. The choir's hymn wrapped around us, a sonic embrace that was at once soothing and unsettling. Each note seemed to pulse with a secret rhythm, resonating deep within our bones, stirring memories long buried beneath ash and ruin. I watched the small group as the music swelled, noting the way Mara's lips moved in quiet prayer, her faith a fragile beacon that drew others toward her warmth. Elias's skepticism was a counterweight, his pragmatism a shield against the alluring promises whispered by the unseen voices. Between them, the survivors found a tentative balance, their disparate hopes and fears entwined by the choir's haunting melody. Yet beneath the fragile camaraderie, an undercurrent of unease thrummed like a low drone. The choir's voices, though beautiful, carried with them a subtle dissonance, a vibration that unsettled the air and stirred shadows in the corners of the cathedral. I felt it keenly, a whisper beneath the hymn, a tremor that teased at the edges of reason. During moments when the melody shifted, growing quieter or more intense, I caught glances exchanged among the group, furtive, questioning. Mara's unwavering devotion clashed silently with Elias's wary gaze, and I could feel the tension coiling between faith and doubt like a serpent waiting to strike. The choir's song was no mere comfort. It was a force that permeated our souls, bending our will and knitting our fears into a shared tapestry. I found myself drawn deeper into its spell, both repelled and fascinated, compelled to understand the source of its power. As the hymn faded into silence, the survivors lingered in the cathedral's hushed gloom. Mara's whispered prayers trailed off, her eyes opening to meet mine with a mixture of hope and desperation. Elias shifted uneasily, his protective stance unyielding, as if preparing for threats both seen and unseen. I closed my journal, the words trembling on the page like fragile echoes of the night. What was this choir that sang to us from the shadows? A beacon of salvation in a world undone, or a siren song luring us toward an unknown abyss? The cathedral held its breath, and so did we, caught between the fleeting warmth of faith and the cold whisper of dread. Tomorrow night, the hymn would rise again, and with it, the uncertain promise of salvation or something far darker. In the half-light of dawn, I lingered in the ruins, listening to the cathedral's silence, haunted by the echo of those voices that had sung us into uneasy hope. The choir had claimed another night, and with it, a deeper mystery that would not be denied. I rose, the weight of the coming days settling heavy on my shoulders. The choir's song was a tide pulling us all, and I was determined to chart its course, no matter the cost. The night was far from over, and the echoes in the dark had only begun their haunting. The candle flames flickered as dusk deepened into night. Mara's soft voice blossomed in the cathedral's hollow, her devotion a fragile glow amidst the ruins. Elias's watchful eyes traced the cracked walls, muscles coiled against threats both real and imagined. I sat between them, my fingers tracing the worn leather of my journal, every note of the choir's hymn weaving a spell that bound us closer, yet frayed the edges of our reason. The melodies wrapped around us, rising and falling like the breath of the world itself, a sound as ancient as the stones beneath our feet. It was a song of hope and warning, a hymn that promised salvation yet whispered of loss. I felt it settle into my chest, a slow drumbeat that quickened with each chorus, calling us to faith while sowing seeds of doubt. Mara's hands clasped tightly in prayer, her pale face illuminated by candlelight, eyes shining with a light that was both fierce and fragile. Elias shifted beside her, his jaw clenched, the scars on his hands a testament to battles won and lost. Between them, the survivors murmured prayers and shared glances, their voices small against the choir's rising tide. As the hymn reached its crescendo, the air thickened with tension, the sound rippling through the cathedral like a living thing. Shadows danced along the broken pews, and I felt the weight of unseen eyes watching, waiting. The choir's song was no mere music, it was a summons, a call to something beyond understanding, When the last note faded, silence fell like a shroud. The group exhaled collectively, some with relief, others with a tremor of fear. Mara opened her eyes, meeting mine with a hopeful smile, while Elias's gaze remained wary, scanning the darkness beyond the shattered windows. I closed my journal, the words within heavy with questions unanswered. The Choa's hymn had drawn us together, but at what price? Was this fragile hope a balm for our battered souls, or a trap set in the ruins of a dying world? Tomorrow night, the choir would sing again, and we would listen, caught once more between faith and fear, hope and despair, salvation and the unknown. The cathedral was alive with a strange pulse that night, the kind that settled deep beneath skin and bone, whispering promises wrapped in shadows. Flickering candles cast trembling light on crumbling stone, their flames dancing in rhythm with the unseen Choa's hymn. I sat among the ragged group, each face etched with the same tentative hope I bore, listening as those ethereal voices reached through the hollow arches, weaving a song both haunting and beautiful. The melody held us captive, a fragile thread connecting our fractured souls amid the desolation outside. Mara, as always, sang softly beneath her breath, her pale lips moving in reverence, eyes closed as if the music could shield her from the horrors we'd endured. Elias sat rigid, his hands clenched, surveying the gathering with a protective gaze that never wavered. As the hymn swelled, a weight settled over me, a sense of something both sacred and terrible entwined in those harmonies. I glanced around, noting the absorbed faces, the trembling hands, the tight grips on worn relics and scraps of faith. The choir's song promised salvation, a light in the darkness, yet beneath that promise lurked a shadow I could not name. The final note quivered and faded, leaving a suffocating silence that pressed against my ears. Then, a sharp intake of breath broke the stillness. Mara's eyes snapped open, wide with alarm. "Thomas," she whispered. The man who had sat beside her was gone. The seat was empty, no sign of struggle, no trace left behind. Just a cold space where a survivor had been moments before. A ripple of panic spread instantly. "Where did he go?" Elias demanded, voice rough with disbelief. "He was right here," no one answered. The shadows seemed to close in, swallowing the quiet that followed. I stood slowly, scanning the faces around me for answers that would not come. Mara sank to her knees, hands clasped in prayer, murmuring pleas for Thomas's soul. Elias's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening with suspicion and fear. The air grew thick with tension, the fragile bonds we'd nurtured cracking under the weight of this new terror. Was the choir's hymn a blessing or a curse? Had we been lured into a trap disguised as salvation? My mind raced, grasping for understanding amid a swirling storm of dread and hope. I felt the old guilt rise, a familiar, suffocating presence. Thomas's disappearance was not just a loss, it was a harbinger. The choir's promise had exacted its price, and I could no longer stand by as a mere witness. Questions burned in my chest. What was this choir? What did it want from us? And how many more would vanish beneath its haunting song? That night, as the survivors whispered fears and prayers, I retreated to the shadowed recesses of the cathedral, clutching my journal. The pen felt heavy in my hand, each word a small act of defiance against the encroaching darkness. I wrote of the vanished, of the fractured trust, of the impossible choice looming before us all. The choir's hymn had ended, but its echo lingered, a spectral thread pulling at the edges of my sanity. And somewhere deep within those haunting melodies, I sensed a truth waiting to be uncovered, a truth that could either save us or doom us all. As I closed the journal, the cathedral seemed to breathe around me, the shadows shifting with whispered voices just beyond hearing. The night was far from over, and neither was the nightmare that had begun with a single disappearance. I steeled myself. Tomorrow I would seek answers. But tonight I was left with only the choir's fading song and the gnawing certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. The lantern's flicker cast long, wavering shadows across the cracked stone altar, where Sister Agnes carefully unrolled a brittle parchment stained with centuries of dust and neglect. The air inside the ruined cathedral was thick with damp and decay, yet the distant choir's haunting hymn seeped through the fractured walls. A spectral soundtrack to our gathering. I knelt beside her, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the faded symbols that danced faintly in the lantern's trembling light. "These are fragments," Sister Agnes whispered, her voice brittle yet urgent. "Written before the fall, before the world shattered. They speak of the choir of voices not meant for mortal ears, and of salvation that demands a price." Her trembling finger traced the arcane script, each mark a riddle etched by hands long gone. The cathedral around us seemed to breathe with a memory of its own, the stones humming faintly beneath our feet. I swallowed hard, torn between the desire to understand and the dread of what understanding might bring. Elias stood nearby, his arms crossed tightly over his scarred chest. His eyes, sharp and wary, flicked from the ancient text to the shadows lurking beyond the lantern's glow. "We can't afford distractions," he said gruffly, voice low but filled with an edge that betrayed his fear. "This choir, whatever it is, it's a trap. We need order, not superstition." I met his gaze, feeling the weight of his pragmatism pressing against my own restless curiosity. "But if we don't know what we're dealing with, how can we protect ourselves?" He shook his head, frustration etched deep in the lines around his mouth. "Protection comes from trust and discipline, not chasing ghosts in the dark." The tension between us was palpable, a fragile thread threatening to snap as the choir's hymn swelled, weaving through the cathedral's broken arches like a siren's call. Sister Agnes looked between us, her eyes shadowed with sorrow and wisdom. "The texts speak of a fallen celestial order," she murmured, "a choir not of angels, but echoes remnants of a grace corrupted by the apocalypse. They sang to save, but their salvation was twisted into a snare." A cold shiver ran down my spine. The idea of salvation bound with entrapment, hope laced with doom, echoed the very turmoil twisting in my gut. I pulled out my journal, eager to capture every word, every symbol, afraid that forgetting would mean losing the fragile thread of truth that might save us or doom us all. As I scribbled feverishly, the cathedral's cracked, stained glass windows caught the last light of a dying sun. A sudden gust whispered through the shattered panes, scattering shards like crystal tears across the stone floor. The sound was sharp, startling like the faintest echo of a warning. Murmurs rippled through the gathering survivors. Mara's pale face was drawn, eyes wide and haunted as she clutched a frayed prayer cloth. Elias's jaw tightened, muscles coiling with the instinct to protect, to control. The choir's melody swelled once more, a tapestry of voices both beautiful and terrible, threading through the ancient stones and into our souls. I closed my journal briefly, looking up into the cavernous darkness above. The cathedral's vaults, shattered and skeletal, framed the night sky vast and indifferent. The choir, I realized, was a reflection of this world's ruin, a fractured promise, a whisper of salvation that demanded faith as currency. "There are warnings," Sister Agnes continued, voice breaking with emotion. "Prophecies incomplete, but clear enough. The choir's hymn calls to those lost in despair, offering peace in exchange for their essence. Each voice added to the eternal song, a sacrifice that sustains the choir's power." A cold dread settled over us like a shroud. The first disappearance, the vanishing of a listener at the hymn's end, it all fit into a pattern darker than any of us dared admit. Yet Mara clung to hope, her whispered prayers threading through the cathedral's shadows like fragile light. Elias stepped forward, voice firm. "We can't wait for answers from ghosts and faded writings. We need plans, defenses. This choir isn't salvation, it's a threat." His words struck a chord, but also deepened the fissures within our fragile group. I felt the weight of leadership pressing down, the impossible task of holding this fractured family together amid shadows and suspicion. That night, as the choir resumed its eerie hymn, I sat alone in the cold crypt beneath the altar, journal open on my knees. The ancient texts whispered secrets between the lines, secrets that might unravel the choir's enigma or bind us forever to its haunting melody. Outside, the wind howled through the cathedral's broken spires, carrying with it the faintest echo of the past, a choir of whispers, promises, and warnings. I closed my eyes, listening. Between hope and dread, faith and fear, the world held its breath, waiting for the next note. And as the final words of the hymn faded into silence, I felt the weight of unseen eyes upon us all, watching, waiting for faith's fragile thread to break. The night was far from over. The air inside the cathedral hung heavy, with the scent of dust and smoke, mingling with the faint, lingering notes of the choir's distant hymn. I sat near the cracked stone altar, fingers tracing the jagged edges of a shard of stained glass that had fallen months ago. The silence was broken by the sharp, urgent footsteps echoing through the nave. Jonas appeared at the threshold, his breath ragged, clothes torn and muddied from his recent journey. Clutched tightly in his hand was a rough parchment, crudely sketched with symbols and strange lines that I had never seen before. His eyes wide with a mixture of exhaustion and something else, hope locked onto mine. "I found something," he said, voice low but steady. The others gathered swiftly, drawn as always to any flicker of news from beyond our stone sanctuary. Mara's pale face lit with a fragile light, while Elias's brow furrowed deeper, the scars on his hands tightening as he crossed his arms. Jonas's tale unfolded like a whispered secret. Beyond the shattered walls, through the cracked streets and twisted metal skeletons of cars, he had seen signs, markings etched into wood and stone that suggested others still survived. Strange symbols, almost like a language but alien in form, marked safe paths or warned of dangers. Small camps flickered with firelight in the distance, signs of life in a world that had long given up on such luxuries. "They were out there," Jonas said, voice barely more than a breath. "Not just shadows or ghosts, real people like us, but—" His pause was heavy, the unspoken threat hanging thick. Mara's lips trembled as she looked toward the choir's shattered, stained glass windows, as if the promise of salvation from the ethereal voices might now be questioned. Elias stepped forward, his voice gruff and wary. "Or they're a trap. We don't know what's out there, and we can't risk bringing danger inside these walls." I took the map from Jonas, running my fingers over the strange, indecipherable marks. The symbols whispered of a forgotten language, or perhaps a new one born from survival's harsh necessity. Somewhere in the lines and curves lay hope, and perhaps peril. The choir's hymns still echoed faintly overhead, a reminder of the fragile sanctuary we had built around those voices. "We have to consider both," I said, voice steady though my heart hammered. "We cannot ignore the possibility of others, but neither can we abandon caution. The choir's promise is not without cost, but the world beyond these walls is no less cruel." Mara stepped closer to me, her eyes bright with the fierce conviction that had always anchored us. "If there are others, maybe salvation isn't just a song. Maybe it's something we have to find with our own hands." Elias's jaw clenched, the tension in the room thickening like a storm about to break. "And if they're hostile, we can't afford to be naive." The conversation spiraled, voices rising and falling like the tides, each word a wave crashing against the fragile hope that sustained us. Outside, the wind moaned through the broken arches, carrying with it the faintest echo of the choir's hymn, both a promise and a warning. As night deepened, I found myself alone near the altar once more, the map spread before me. The strange symbols pulsed with a silent urgency, a call to venture beyond or a trap laid in shadow. The choir's songs had always been a beacon in the darkness, but now the darkness beyond our walls whispered back with its own secrets. I closed my eyes, listening to the faintest notes of the hymn weaving through the cold stone. The choice ahead was no longer between faith and fear alone, it was between the haunting melody of salvation and the uncertain silence of the outside world. And somewhere in that silence, the fate of us all awaited. The night held its breath, and so did we. The cathedral's vast interior, fractured by time and ruin, held a fragile quiet, punctuated only by the soft rustling of ragged fabric and the distant, ethereal hum of the choir's hymn. I found myself drawn to the far corner, where Mara knelt, her slender frame bowed low in prayer. The candlelight flickered, casting dancing shadows across her pale face, illuminating eyes that burned with a fierce, trembling light. Her whispered hymns blended seamlessly with the choir's disembodied melody, a fragile thread of faith woven into the vast tapestry of despair that had become our nightly ritual. Mara's devotion was a beacon in the darkness, a fragile flame flickering stubbornly against the encroaching shadows. Yet as I watched her, a knot of unease twisted deeper in my gut. The choir's songs had grown louder, more insistent, weaving into our souls with a power that felt both sacred and sinister. I wondered how long such faith could withstand the tides of fear that were rising like a storm around us. The tension within our group was palpable. Caleb, ever the skeptic, had been growing restless, his sharp eyes darting over every whispered prayer and hopeful glance. I caught sight of him now, standing rigid against a crumbling pillar, his lean frame tense as he watched Mara with a mixture of frustration and something colder, fear, perhaps, or anger. His voice, when he spoke, cut through the quiet like a shard of glass. "Do you really believe this choir is salvation?" Caleb's words were harsh, accusatory. "Or is it just a cruel trick, a sound that lures us deeper into darkness?" Mara's head snapped up, her haunting eyes flashing with a desperate light. "It is salvation," she insisted, voice trembling but resolute. "The choir promises us peace beyond this shattered world. We must hold to faith, even when all else is lost." Caleb shook his head, stepping forward, his voice rising. "Faith won't save us from vanishing like the others. This choir, it's a trap. We were fools to listen, fools to hope." The words hung heavy in the air, a rift opening between belief and doubt. I felt the weight of leadership pressing down, the fragile bonds holding us together starting to fray. I stepped between them, hands raised in a gesture of peace, my voice calm but firm. "We must hold together. Our survival depends on unity, not division. The choir's nature is still a mystery, yes, but despair will only hasten our end. Let us seek understanding, not conflict." Elias, standing nearby with his stocky frame and scarred face, nodded grimly. "We need order, or we'll fall apart before the choir's secrets reveal themselves." But beneath my words, a storm of doubt churned. Was the choir truly a beacon of hope, or something darker, more insidious? Each night, its melodies wrapped tighter around us, a sonic embrace both comforting and suffocating. The lines between faith and fear blurred, and I feared what lay ahead. As the choir's hymns swelled, echoing through the shattered nave, the air thickened with a suffocating weight. The ancient stones seemed to pulse with energy, shadows shifting just beyond sight. I caught Mara's glance, her eyes shining with unwavering belief, and Caleb's, sharp with suspicion. Between them, I stood caught in the fragile balance between hope and dread. The night deepened, and the choir's song grew louder still, a haunting melody that promised salvation and whispered of loss. I knew the coming days would test us all, our faith, our courage, and the very bonds that held us together. And as the final notes faded into the cold stone, a single thought echoed in my mind: how much more could we endure before the choir claimed us all? I closed my journal slowly, the ink still wet with the night's thoughts. The fragile piece we clung to was slipping through our fingers like smoke. The choir's hymn was no longer just a song, it was a summons, and soon we would have to answer. The night air inside the ruined cathedral was thick with an uneasy silence, as if the very stones themselves held their breath. We gathered as always beneath the shattered arches, our small band of survivors huddled close, flickering candles casting long, wavering shadows over the cracked stone floor. The choir began again, an eerie, disembodied hymn that rolled through the cavernous space, its voices ethereal yet hauntingly clear. Each note seemed to vibrate deep within my chest, a sound both beautiful and terrible, promising salvation yet tinged with menace. I watched Mara, her slender frame tense with reverence, lips moving in soft prayer as she sang along with the invisible voices. Her pale face was a mask of fragile hope, eyes glistening with unshed tears. Nearby, Elias stood rigid, his stocky form casting a protective shadow over the others. His scarred features were drawn tight with skepticism and fear, his gaze darting uneasily toward the core's source, or rather, the absence of it. As the hymn reached its crescendo, a sudden silence fell, sharp and unnatural. I saw it then. Jonas was gone. One moment he was there, eyes closed in solemn attention. The next, nothing but the empty space where he had sat. A chill raced down my spine, the quiet shattered only by the lingering echoes of the choir's fading hymn. Shock rippled through the group like a physical blow. Mara gasped, clutching the edge of a broken pew, her voice trembling as she whispered prayers for Jonas's safe passage. Elias's jaw clenched, fists balled at his sides, his protective instincts flaring into desperation. Caleb's skepticism erupted like a spark to dry tinder. "This isn't salvation," he spat bitterly. "It's a trap. A curse." Sister Agnes, ever the voice of tempered wisdom, raised a frail hand for silence. Her eyes, deep set and lined with the weight of years, scanned the faces around her. "We cannot yet understand the choir's nature," she said softly, "but we must not let fear fracture our resolve. There is history here, buried beneath these stones, that may hold answers." The room grew tense, divisions sharpening between those clinging to faith and those consumed by dread. I felt the weight of leadership settle heavily upon me. I knew that waiting passively would only invite further loss. Tonight, I would venture into the cathedral's shadowed depths, into the hidden chambers whispered of in fragmented tales and half-remembered lore. Armed with a flickering lantern and a heart pounding with both fear and determination, I descended the cracked stone steps leading beneath the nave. The air grew colder, damper, thick with the musty scent of forgotten time. My footsteps echoed hollowly as I moved through narrow corridors lined with ancient carvings and chipped statues, remnants of a world lost to ruin. Strange symbols caught my eye, etched deep into the walls, glowing faintly as if alive with some otherworldly energy. The choir's hymn seemed to pulse in the air itself, the sound now a tangible thread weaving through the shadows, wrapping around my senses and tugging at the edges of my mind. I fought to hold on to clarity, to separate reality from the creeping tendrils of despair that threatened to unravel me. Back above, voices rose in heated argument. Elias's pragmatic caution clashed violently with Caleb's biting cynicism, while Mara's wavering faith sought to bridge the widening gulf. Sister Agnes stood between them, her voice a fragile thread of calm in a storm of doubt and fear. As I explored the subterranean depths, the truth remained elusive, a whispered puzzle suspended in the darkness. Yet I could not turn back. The choir's hymn was no longer a distant melody, it was a summons, a snare, a riddle woven into the very fabric of our shattered world. And I, burdened with both hope and dread, was determined to unravel it before the choir claimed more souls. The cathedral seemed alive in the half-light, shadows shifting just beyond the edge of vision, voices rising and falling like waves upon a shore of silence. Each step forward was a step deeper into the unknown, a plunge into a mystery that might save us or doom us all. And as the night stretched on, the haunting refrain of the choir's hymn echoed endlessly in my mind, a relentless reminder that in this place, salvation came at a terrible price. The second vanishing was no accident, it was a warning, a challenge, and I was resolved to meet it head-on, no matter the cost. But as I paused in the darkness, feeling the weight of unseen eyes upon me, one question lingered, cold and unyielding: what secrets did this cathedral truly hold? And would the answers bring deliverance or despair? The choir's song rose again, beckoning me forward into the abyss. The heavy flagstone trembled under my fingers, the rough edges biting into my skin as I levered it loose from the altar's shadowed corner. Dust and the scent of ancient stone filled the stale air, spilling forth like a breath held for centuries. A narrow stairway yawned open, swallowed by darkness so deep it seemed to drink the faint light of the shattered cathedral above. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, each pulse sensing with the distant. disembodied choir that sang beyond these walls, an eerie lullaby promising salvation, yet laced with dread. I peered into the abyss, the faint glimmer of cold air brushing my face. Elias stood behind me, his broad frame tense, eyes sharp as ever. Sister Agnes hovered near the entrance, her gnarled hands clutching a worn prayer book, lips moving in silent invocation. The fragile hope that bound us all flickered uncertainly in the face of this descent. "Are you certain about this?" Elias' voice was low, edged with the wary pragmatism that had kept us alive this long. "We have no choice," I replied, voice barely above a whisper. "If the core's power anchors here, we must understand it." One cautious step, then another. The stairs groaned beneath our weight, crumbling stone dust swirling upward like specters in the dim light of a battered lantern. The core's hymn, distant yet unmistakable, seeped through the cracks in the floorboards above, weaving into the very air around us. It was a melody that promised reprieve yet held a sinister undertone, like a siren's call veiled in sacred song. At the bottom, the chamber unfolded like a cryptic shrine. The walls, carved from ancient stone, bore symbols that pulsed faintly with an otherworldly luminescence, cold and unyielding. Rusted relics littered the floor, shattered crosses, hymnals whose pages curled and crumbled at the edges. Chalices tarnished and etched with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when glanced at sideways. Each object whispered a story of faith corrupted, a history steeped in the apocalypse's cruel embrace. Sister Agnes moved closer, fingers tracing a faded emblem on the wall. "These markings," she murmured, voice trembling, "are from a celestial order long fallen. Their remnants echo here, trapped in this place between worlds." The whispers began then, faint voices threading through the chamber like threads of smoke. They wove discordant harmonies, overlapping and fracturing, the sound shifting and bending until reality itself seemed to fray at the edges. Shadows flickered and danced beyond the lantern's glow, shapes too vague to name but too close to ignore. A cold presence settled around me, a weight pressing deep into my bones. "It watches," I said, swallowing the rising panic, not with eyes but with sound and silence. Elias tightened his grip on the hilt of his knife, jaw clenched. "We're not alone down here." I forced myself to steady my breath, to push back the creeping fear that sought to consume every thought. This chamber was the heart of the choir's enigma, the source of its dark hymn. To protect the survivors, to save what fragile hope remained, I had to confront it even if it meant walking into the abyss. As we ascended back toward the cathedral's hollowed nave, the choir's melody followed, weaving into my thoughts like a thread tying me to some terrible fate. The relics, the symbols, the whispers, they all spoke of a salvation stained with loss, a grace that demanded a price no soul could fully bear. Elias's voice broke through my reverie. "We can't trust the choir." "Not anymore," I nodded, feeling the weight of leadership settle heavier than ever before. The hidden chamber had revealed truths darker than I dared imagine, but it had also steeled my resolve. We would face the choir, unravel its song, and fight for those still clinging to life within these shattered stones. Outside, the cold wind whispered through broken, stained glass, carrying the fading echoes of a hymn that was both a promise and a curse. The cathedral, once a sanctuary of faith, now stood a monument to the fragile endurance of hope amid ruin. And beneath its stones, the choir waited, singing on. The cathedral's cold stones seemed to absorb the murmurs of whispered accusations and unspoken fears, their ancient surfaces bearing silent witness to the fractures growing within our small group. I sat perched on a broken pew, the journal resting on my knees like a fragile lifeline, yet the words I sought to inscribe refused to form. Outside, the choir's hymn began to rise, weaving its eerie tendrils through the hollowed nave, thickening the air with a melody both haunting and seductive. Elias approached me then, his heavy boots thudding against the cracked floor, a shadow cast long and imposing. His stocky frame was hunched with tension, scars etched deep in his weathered skin catching the faint light like ancient runes. "You rechasing ghosts?" he said, voice rough but steady, eyes burning with the pragmatism that had kept us alive this far. This obsession with the core, it's tearing us apart. We need order, not riddles. I met his gaze, seeing not just frustration, but an undercurrent of fear. Order without understanding is blind, I replied, voice low yet firm. If we don't uncover the core's nature, how can we protect ourselves? He shook his head, exasperation warring with concern. Protection means sticking to what we know. Survive the night, not chase salvation that might be a trap. The tension between us crackled like static, a clash of belief and skepticism that had become the group's uneasy undercurrent. Elias represented the harsh reality, the need for survival grounded in discipline and caution. I, haunted by memories of a life steeped in faith and scholarship, was drawn inexorably toward unraveling the core's enigma, even as doubt gnawed at my resolve. Meanwhile, Mara moved through the gathering shadows with a silent urgency I had not noticed before. Her pale face, once alight with devout fervor, now bore traces of doubt and fear. At times, she would join the core's hymn with trembling voice, her slender frame swaying as if held aloft by fragile hope. Yet when eyes met hers, a flicker of something unspoken passed between us, an unsteady wavering that tugged at my heart. One night, as the core's voices reached their ethereal crescendo, I found Mara absent from the circle. Panic flared briefly before I noticed the faint outline of her figure slipping beneath the cathedral's arches. I called after her, but the shadows swallowed my words. I followed, heart pounding in my chest, the cold air thick with the scent of damp stone and ancient dust. The melody lingered, more insistent now, pulling at Mara like a siren's call. I caught glimpses of her pale form moving toward the choir's source, a fragile wraith drawn to a flame that could consume her. When she vanished beyond the veil of sound, a sharp cry echoed, a haunting rupture in the night that shattered our fragile calm. The survivors stirred, eyes wide with fear and suspicion. Elias's voice cut through the rising panic. She shouldn't have gone alone. We were not safe while this choir holds sway over us. I stood amid the chaos, the weight of leadership pressing down like a stone. The choir's hymn hovered still, a spectral embrace that promised salvation yet demanded a terrible price. As Mara disappeared into its depths, the fissures within our group deepened. Faith and fear, hope and suspicion tangled into a tangled knot that threatened to unravel us all. In the quiet moments that followed, I sought refuge in my journal, the ink flowing at last but stained with the shadows of doubt. Could I hold them together? Could I protect what remained? Or would the choir's song claim us one by one, until only silence remained within the ruined cathedral's bones? The night pressed on, heavy and unyielding, the choir's hymn a relentless pulse beneath the shattered vaults. And somewhere in the darkness, Mara's voice had fallen silent, swallowed by the very salvation she had sought. I closed my eyes, listening to the fading echoes, knowing the true fracture was not just within the group, but within myself. The battle between belief and terror was only beginning, and I was caught in its merciless grip. The next night would bring no answers, only the haunting promise of the choir's next hymn, and the dreadful silence that followed. Night had fallen like a shroud over the cathedral, the desolate shell of stone and shattered glass, holding the remnants of our fragile sanctuary. Mara had been restless all day, her devout faith simmering beneath the surface, a fragile flame flickering in the oppressive shadows. As the survivors gathered beneath the high, broken arches, an uneasy silence passed among us, each of us drawn by the haunting promise of the choir's hymn, yet haunted by the memory of those who had vanished before. She stepped forward alone, slender and pale, her haunting eyes reflecting the dim candlelight that barely held back the darkness. The choir's melody began to swell, ethereal voices weaving a tapestry of sound that seemed both a balm and a snare. The notes resonated through the cathedral's bones, wrapping around each of us like a spectral embrace, promising salvation even as they whispered of doom. I stood close, heart pounding, watching Mara's figure as she lifted her head, singing softly along with the disembodied choir. There was a lightness to her movements, a fragile hope that belayed the dread that tightened my chest. Around us, the others watched in silence, some with reverence, others with suspicion. Elias's steady gaze never wavered from her, his stocky frame tense, ready to intervene if the shadows took her. Then, abruptly, the choir's hymn ceased. The last note faded into the cold stone air, leaving a silence so deep it roared in my ears. Mara was gone. A stunned hush fell over the gathering, broken only by a rising tide of frantic calls, her name echoing through the vast, empty nave. I called out too, voice raw with panic, pushing through the crowd and into the shadowed aisles. The cold walls seemed to close in, swallowing sound as if mocking our desperation. Flickering candlelight cast grotesque shapes, shadows twisting and writhing in the gloom. Elias was beside me, his voice sharp with anger and fear. "This can't go on," he spat. "Your obsession with the choir is tearing us apart. If she's gone, it's 'cause you let it happen." Caleb's sneer cut through the tension. "Maybe the choir isn't salvation, it's a trap. And you're the one leading us into it." His words fanned the growing flames of mistrust, splitting the survivors into factions of believers and skeptics. I felt the weight of their accusations like stones on my chest, but beneath it all burned an even darker truth. Mara's disappearance was no accident. The choir's promise came at a terrible cost, one we had been desperate to ignore. Guilt gnawed at me. Had I failed to protect her? Had my hope blinded me to the danger? Later, alone in the quiet corner of the cathedral, I opened my journal, fingers trembling as I traced the lines of my own thoughts and fears. The ancient texts Sister Agnes had shared lay scattered around me, their cryptic warnings now cutting sharper than ever. The distant echo of the choir's hymn haunted the silence, a ghostly reminder that our sanctuary was also our prison. I knew then that the path ahead would demand more than courage, it would require sacrifice. And yet, the question that burned brightest in my mind was impossible to answer. Who would be next to vanish into the choir's eternal song? The night stretched on, heavy with dread and desperate hope, as the ruined cathedral held its secrets tight. Outside, the apocalypse waited. But within these walls, the true battle between faith and fear had only just begun. And as the first pale light of dawn crept through the fractured stained glass, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The cathedral's battered nave was thick with unease, the brittle silence shattered by sharp words and bitter accusations. The survivors, once bound by fragile hope in the choir's salvation, now stood divided, a schism forged in fear and doubt. I watched as Caleb stepped forward, his lean frame tense, eyes gleaming with a fierce need to unravel the illusions that held us captive. "We can't keep pretending," Caleb's voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. "This choir isn't salvation. It's a trap, a snare that's already taken too many of us. Mara's gone, and who's next? We follow these ghostly songs and we vanish one by one. Is that the future we want?" The words hung heavy in the stale air, stirring a storm of whispers and glances. Mara's disappearance had left a wound raw and bleeding, and now Caleb's defiance threatened to tear the fragile fabric of our community apart. I felt the weight of their eyes turn toward me, the unspoken question pressing down. What did I believe? Could I still cling to hope when it felt like the choir was a siren's call to oblivion? My heart pounded with the urgency of their need for answers, but the more I searched within, the more the lines blurred between salvation and horror. Elias, ever the sentinel, stepped beside Caleb, his stocky form a steadying presence. "Doubt's natural," he said gruffly, voice steady despite the tension. "But we can't let it unravel us. We need order, not chaos." His words were a bomb to some, yet a spark to others. The room fractured into murmuring factions, those clinging to faith, those succumbing to fear. Mara's absence was a ghost that haunted every corner, her pale face a symbol of fragile belief and the high cost it demanded. In the midst of the clamor, Sister Agnes moved quietly to my side, her lined face a map of sorrow and wisdom. Her voice, low and trembling, drew me close. "The choir is not what it seems," she whispered, eyes darting nervously. "Ancient texts speak of a song that binds and devours. A melody born from ruin, neither holy light nor dark. It is a crossroads, faith's test, or a descent into oblivion." Her cryptic warning deepened the shadow that had settled over my heart. The choir was no simple hymn of hope. It was a force with a dual nature, a twisted echo of the apocalypse itself. Marat knelt nearby, her slender form bowed in silent prayer, lips moving in trembling devotion. Her fragile faith was a fragile flame in the gathering dusk, a stark contrast to Caleb's harsh skepticism. Elias watched over her like a guardian, the scars on his hands a testament to battles fought and lost not just with enemies, but with the darkness within. I felt the weight of leadership press down on me like a shroud. To guide was to choose sides, to face the impossible task of holding together a group unraveling at the seams. The choir's melodies lingered in the air, haunting, seductive, a siren's call that promised salvation yet whispered of sacrifice. As the night deepened, voices rose and fell in fractious debate, hope and fear warring in every heart. I closed my eyes, hearing the choir's hymn swell beyond the shattered stained glass, a haunting symphony that blurred the line between grace and damnation. Could faith survive in a world where every prayer might be the last? Could hope endure when the price was the vanishing of those we cherished? The answer remained elusive, a fragile thread woven through the darkness. And so the choir sang on, its eerie hymn wrapping around us like a shroud, drawing us deeper into the mystery, into the impossible choice between salvation and loss. The night stretched before us, heavy with silence and song. Somewhere in that haunting melody, the truth waiting for us to listen, to understand, to decide. The cathedral's cold stone walls seemed to press inward that night, the thick shadows pooling beneath the shattered, stained glass windows like ink spilled on parchment. The choir's hymn rose again, ethereal, haunting, a sound that swirled around us, both balm and curse. Elias stood apart from the group, his jaw clenched, so tightly I thought the muscles might snap. His eyes, usually so guarded, were wild, flickering with a storm I had only glimpsed once before, an old rage, buried deep beneath his pragmatic exterior. "This has to end," Elias muttered, voice low but fierce as he paced the nave. "We can't keep waiting for this phantom to claim us. It's not salvation, it's death." His words landed heavy, shattering the fragile calm we'd maintained. Mara's pale face tightened as she clutched her rosary, whispering prayers that trembled with desperation. Caleb, ever the skeptic, arched an eyebrow and exchanged a look with me that begged for reason amidst the chaos. "What do you propose?" I asked Elias, stepping closer, wary yet compelled. "Destroying the source won't be easy. We don't know what we're dealing with." He met my gaze, fiery and resolute. "We have to try. If we don't, we all lost to that song." The words were both a warning and a plea. The group gathered cautiously around the cracked altar, the heart of the cathedral's ruins where strange vibrations thrummed softly beneath our feet. It was here, beneath centuries-old stone and twisted pews, that the choir's voice seemed rooted in unseen force that bent the air itself. Elias produced a set of crude tools, scraps fashioned from scavenged metal, and began working with grim determination. Sparks flew as hammer met stone, the sharp clang ringing out in the vast chamber. The others watched, breath held, caught between hope and dread. Suddenly, a low hum deepened into a roar, the temperature dropping sharply. Shadows twisted unnaturally along the walls, as if the cathedral itself recoiled from our assault. Elias's hand shook, sweat slicking his brow, but he pressed on, fueled by anger and fear. Then came the crack, a fissure spider webbing across the altar's surface, and a sudden burst of discordant sound that pierced the air like a scream. The choir's hymn fractured, warping into something grotesque and raw. The group recoiled, some clutching ears, others stepping back in terror. Elias stumbled, dropping his tools, and slammed his fist against the stone in frustration.
"Damn it!"
he growled, breath-ragged, eyes wild with guilt and fury. "It's too strong. We can't fight it with brute force." I moved to steady him, feeling the tremors in his body as rage threatened to consume him. "We need another way," I said quietly, voice steady though my heart pounded. Violence only feeds the darkness. Around us, the chore's melody resumed, softer now, weaving through the rubble like a serpent's whisper. Mara wept softly, her faith shaken but unbroken, while Caleb's cold stare weighed heavily on us all. That night, as the survivors dispersed into the shadows of the cathedral, the weight of Elias's outburst lingered. The fragile unity we'd nurtured was stretched thin, like the fraying threads of a tapestry unraveling in the wind. I withdrew to a corner, lighting a flickering candle, and opened my journal. The choir's hymn threaded through the silence, a haunting reminder of the power. We faced a power that was neither wholly divine nor entirely malevolent. I wrote of Elias's struggle, of the failed attempt to silence the choir's call, and of the growing fear that our salvation might come at a price too terrible to pay. But beneath the despair, a flicker of resolve remained. We would endure. We had to. For the world outside was broken, but here, within these ruined walls, the echoes of faith and fear sang on, and I was determined to understand their song, no matter the cost. The night stretched long, the choir's hymn fading into the cold dawn, leaving behind only questions and the heavy silence of what was yet to come. And still the choir sang. The flickering torchlight barely penetrated the thick darkness as I stepped cautiously into the cathedral's hidden chamber. The air was dense, heavy with a cold that gnawed at my skin and whispered secrets I could not yet understand. Around me, the ancient stones seemed to pulse with a living presence, as if the very walls breathed in time with the faint, haunting hymns that now filled the space. The choir was no longer distant. It surrounded me, a swirling tempest of voices that wove together in a melody both exquisite and unbearable. Each note was a thread pulling at my soul, a shimmering tether between hope and despair. The shadows danced in the corners of my vision, shifting, contorting into shapes that defied reason, neither wholly there nor entirely absent. They moved as if alive, responding to the music with a will of their own. I tried to steady my breath, to anchor myself in the reality I clung to so desperately. But the choir's song was a siren call, seducing me with promises too potent to ignore. Come, it seemed to say, join us in the eternal hymn, where pain dissolves and peace awaits. A voice emerged from the cacophony, singular yet layered with countless harmonies, a presence without form, yet as tangible as the cold stone beneath my feet. The choir entity spoke, its words a melody that resonated in my bones. We are the song beyond the end, the voice that lingers when the world falls silent. We offer salvation, a release from the torment of survival. But every gift demands its price. Fear clawed at my heart. I understood then the terrible truth. The choir was both savior and captor, a force that beckoned with salvation yet devoured the very souls it claimed to save. Each disappearance was not a random loss, but a sacrifice woven into the fabric of its eternal hymn. I faltered, overwhelmed by the weight of this revelation. How could I reconcile the choir's twisted grace with the hope it inspired? Was this monstrous promise the last refuge for the desperate, or a pitiless trap from which none could escape? The voices surged again, urging me to surrender, to let go of the fear and join the symphony that transcended flesh and pain. But I resisted, clinging to the fragile hope that something beyond this spectral embrace still endured. Alone in the chamber, surrounded by fading echoes and shifting shadows, I made my choice not yet to yield, but to fight for the survivors still bound to this haunted sanctuary. The path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty, the boundary between faith and horror blurred beyond recognition. As the choir's final notes lingered and dissolved into silence, a cold resolve settled within me. The night's confrontation had changed everything. The cathedral was no longer just a refuge. It was a battleground between salvation and damnation, and I was its reluctant champion. But as I turned back toward the gathering beyond the chamber's threshold, I knew the hardest trials were yet to come. The choir's true form was revealed, but its song was far from over, and somewhere within its haunting melody lay the fate of us all waiting to be decided. I pressed my hand to the cold stone wall, steadying myself. The choir's voice had shown me the abyss, and now I had to decide whether to stare into it or to pull the others back from the edge. The night stretched ahead, dark and endless, but I would not let the choir claim us without a fight. With a final lingering echo of the ethereal hymn fading behind me, I stepped forward, ready to face whatever came next. The stone beneath my fingers was cold and unforgiving, etched with the faint tracings of angels long faded into myth. The cathedral, once a sanctuary of light and song, now lay in broken silence, the echoes of the choir's final hymn lingering like a ghost upon the cracked walls. We gathered beneath the shattered vaults, our ragged forms huddled close amid the rubble. The flickering candlelight casting trembling shadows that danced like specters across the remnants of stained glass. It was in this fragile stillness that the weight of what we had endured settled upon us, a weight heavier than any apocalypse outside these walls. Some among us found a strange comfort in the choir's defeat, a grim peace that came with the end of its relentless calls. Mara, pale and fragile, knelt in quiet prayer, her lips moving in trembling song, seeking solace in the faith that had both sustained and betrayed her. Elias stood apart, his stocky frame tense, eyes sharp beneath furrowed brows as he paced near the cracked altar. His voice was low but steady, a tether to reality, urging us to abandon fading myths and focus instead on survival in this fractured world. The tension between his pragmatism and Mara's devout hope hung in the air, thick as dust. I retreated to the nave alone amid the rubble, tracing the worn carvings of angels and saints that time and ruin had not yet claimed. The choir's nature had revealed itself to me in the confrontation, a presence neither wholly divine nor entirely malevolent, a paradox of salvation and entrapment. This duality gnawed at my spirit, unraveling the fragile threads of faith I had clung to for so long. Was this entity a twisted remnant of celestial grace, or a predator cloaked in the trappings of hope? Sister Agnes sat nearby, her silver hair pulled back tightly, eyes heavy with the burden of wisdom. She unfolded brittle pages of ancient texts, her voice barely above a whisper as she recounted the origins of the choir, a fallen celestial order, cast down and fragmented, their hymn now a siren song for lost souls. Her words wove a tapestry of reverent sorrow and ominous revelation, binding us together in a shared understanding of the terrible beauty that had ensnared us. The survivors around me bore the scars of loss in their haunted eyes. Some had vanished into the choir's eternal hymn, swallowed whole by promises they could not resist. Others lingered, caught between the desperate hope for salvation and the unbearable cost it demanded. I saw in their faces the fragile endurance of faith amid ruin, a testament to humanity's need for meaning even as the world crumbled. Night deepened, and the cathedral's silence grew oppressive, broken only by the soft rustle of whispered prayers and the distant, fading echoes of the choir's song. I opened my journal, the pages rough beneath my fingers, and began to write words born of sorrow, fear, and a flickering hope that maybe, somehow, we could endure. The apocalypse was not only outside these walls, it roared within each of us, a cacophony of doubt and belief, despair and longing. As dawn threatened the horizon, I closed my eyes and listened for the choir's lingering hymn, for the fragile voices of hope that still clung to this broken sanctuary. The cathedral stood silent but alive, a monument to faith's fragile endurance in a world undone. And as the first light crept through shattered glass, I knew the true struggle had only just begun. The question remained, echoing through the hollowed halls and my weary mind, how could faith endure when its source brought both salvation and destruction? This was the burden we bore, the choice laid bare beneath the ruins of a world and a belief system intertwined. Between hope and horror, we stood at the edge of an abyss, searching for a song that might carry us beyond the silence. The cathedral's dim interior was suffused with a pale twilight as Jonas stumbled through the great arched doorway, breath ragged from his hurried journey. He clutched a tattered piece of parchment, edges frayed and stained, upon which crude lines and symbols sprawled like a map of a world barely remembered. The ragtag assembly of survivors, huddled in the cavernous nave, turned their weary eyes toward him, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows over their gaunt faces. "I found something," Jonas announced, voice strained but carrying an urgent edge that immediately drew the group's collective attention. Signs, marks left by others. Not far beyond the broken city walls, a ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd, a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. The choir's distant hymn, ethereal and haunting, seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the tangible possibility of life beyond their ruined sanctuary. I stepped forward, my fingers trembling slightly as I took the map from Jonas' hands. The ink was smudged, but the paths were clear enough, trails leading through shattered streets and over crumbled bridges, converging toward a cluster of markings labeled with symbols eerily reminiscent of those we had found beneath the cathedral. Could they be connected? Another group, perhaps, survivors like us clinging to existence in the wasteland. "How sure are you?" I asked, voice low, scanning the faces around me. Hope flickered in Mara's pale eyes while Elia's narrowed his. Skepticism itched into the lines of his scarred face. "I followed the signs for days," Jonas replied. "They were recent. Fresh markings." Elias stepped forward, his imposing figure casting a protective shadow. "We can't just rush into the unknown. These others might be hostile or worse, led by the same darkness that haunts our nights." Mara's voice broke through the tension, soft but resolute. "Or they might be the salvation we've been singing for. The Choir's promise isn't just empty words. We must have faith." The room divided between Elias's pragmatic caution and Mara's devout hope. I felt the weight of leadership settle heavily upon me. The choir's melodies, ever present, seemed to pulse in my veins, a reminder of the sanctuary we had built amid the apocalypse, yet also a tether to the unknown forces at play. As the night deepened, I found myself drawn to the shattered stained glass window overlooking the desolate cityscape. The fractured colors caught the dying light, casting spectral patterns across the cold stone floor. The choir's faint hymn echoed through the air, an unsettling harmony that both comforted and unnerved me. Could we remain here, trapped between fading faith and creeping fear? Or was it time to step beyond the sanctuary's shadow and face the flickers of life that still danced beyond the ruins? The choice was no longer theoretical, it was imminent. And as the choir's song swelled once more, I knew that whatever path we chose would change us irrevocably. Tonight, the world beyond was no longer just a distant whisper. It was a flicker of fragile light that beckoned us forward, into the darkness that awaited. I closed my eyes and let the melody wash over me, stealing my resolve. Tomorrow, we would decide our fate. But as the final notes faded into silence, a shiver of unease settled in my bones. For the choir's hymn was never just a song, it was a summons. And the world beyond was not just hope. It was a choice between salvation and oblivion. I opened my eyes, the cathedral's shadows long and deep, and whispered into the gathering night, "We must be ready." The flicker beyond the ruins was no longer a dream, it was our future, fragile and terrifying, waiting to be claimed. And so, beneath the cathedral's shattered vaults, amidst the fragile hope and ever-present dread, the survivors prepared to step into the unknown. The choir sang on, its haunting hymn a reminder of the price that awaited us all. Night had fallen deep upon the cathedral, the sky outside a bruised canvas of purple and black. Inside, the shattered glass overhead fractured the dying light into trembling shards of color that danced faintly across the cracked stone floor, and the wary faces gathered beneath. Mara's absence was a hollow etch in the air, palpable and unspoken. We sat in silence, the kind that presses down heavier than any spoken word. No prayers were uttered aloud, none dared break the fragile stillness that wrapped around us like a shroud. The choir's melodies had returned, but this time their song was softer, quieter, an eerie lull that seemed to seep through the cracks in the walls like a slow, inevitable tide. I sat alone near one of the cathedral's ancient pillars, the rough stone cold beneath my fingers, as I held my journal open on my lap. The faint flicker of a half-melted candle cast long shadows, its wavering light illuminating the anxious scrawls of ink that spilled across the yellowed pages. The words felt inadequate to contain the swirl of dread and hope that churned inside me. Each note of the faint choir felt like a thread pulled, taut, threatening to unravel the fragile fabric of our sanity. From across the nave, Elias stood near the broken entrance, his silhouette rigid and watchful. His eyes darted nervously toward the darkness beyond the door, muscles coiled like a spring beneath his worn jacket. His grip tightened around the rifle at his side, every time the choir's faint hymn rose and fell, as though the sound itself carried a threat only he could sense. I envied his certainty, even as I doubted my own resolve. Sister Agnes moved softly among us, her footsteps light as she offered whispered prayers and gentle touches to those who sat with bowed heads. Her voice was a murmur, barely more than a breath against the growing silence, but it carried a fragile comfort. Her face, lined with years and worry, held a flicker of hope that seemed at odds with the heavy despair settling into the corners of the ruined cathedral. Caleb sat near the altar, his restlessness barely contained. His sharp eyes flicked from shadow to shadow, from face to face, questioning everything with a simmering intensity that matched the unease in the air. His skepticism cut through the silence like a blade, a constant reminder of the fragile balance we all tried to maintain between faith and doubt. The choir's hymn wound through the vast space, a ghostly thread weaving through the silence. It was quieter now, but the melody was no less haunting, no less insistent. It beckoned us, whispered promises of salvation and peace, even as it exacted its terrible price. The thought of Mara, her voice once so clear and pure, now swallowed by the same song, sent a cold shudder through me. I found myself writing again. The choir calls softly, a whisper in the void. Each note carries a weight I cannot bear to name. We wait, holding our breath, caught between the salvation it offers and the darkness it conceals. Outside, a distant wind stirred the broken remnants of the cathedral's stained glass, sending a cascade of colored light flickering like ghosts across the cracked walls. Inside, we were shadows, two ghosts clinging to hope in a world that had long since forgotten mercy. As the vigil stretched on, the silence grew heavier, the spaces between the choir's notes widening until the song became a fragile thread, barely holding us together. I could see it in the eyes of those around me, the flicker of fear, the desperate clinging to belief, the silent prayers sent up to a God that might no longer hear. And yet, despite it all, despite the disappearances and the growing dread, none of us could turn away. The choir sang and we listened. We waited and we hoped. The night deepened. The candle guttered low, and the hymn whispered on, calling us ever closer to the edge of something we dared not name. I closed my journal with a trembling hand, the words unfinished, the questions unanswered. Outside, the wind moaned through the cathedral's broken arches, carrying the choir's song into the darkness beyond. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the night was far from over. The candle sputtered, casting a final flicker of light before succumbing to the cold breath of the cathedral. Silence fell once more, thick and suffocating. Yet, beneath the stillness, the faintest echo of the choir's hymn lingered quiet, persistent, inexorable. And somewhere deep inside, I felt its call beckoning me onward, deeper into the shadows of faith and fear. The last silent prayer before the storm. The heavy air within the cathedral shifted once more as twilight booed through the fractured stained glass, throwing shards of muted color across the cold stone floors. I stood near the nave's edge, the collective breaths of the gathered survivors mingling with the faint rustle of worn fabric and the distant drip of water pooling in the cathedral's broken crypts. Each night the choir's hymn returned, a spectral chorus echoing from nowhere yet everywhere, threading its way through our bones and thoughts like a living spirit. But tonight the atmosphere was different, charged, almost electric, with a tension that prickled my skin with cold dread. Shadows, cast by the flickering candles that clung desperately to the brittle air, lengthened and writhed across the cracked walls. They moved not with the flame, but seemed to dance in rhythms dictated by the choir's eerie melody. The voices rose, layered and discordant, weaving a sonic tapestry that was at once beautiful and grotesque. This was more than mere music. It was a living thing, hungry for more than just ears. I slipped away from the gathered group, my footsteps muffled by the threadbare rugs that lined the nave. There was a pull toward the choir loft, that place I had long avoided except for brief, necessary inspections. Tonight, something compelled me upward, as if the source of the choir's power awaited my scrutiny. The narrow staircase groaned beneath my weight, each creak a whispered warning. When I reached the loft I paused, heart hammering, as the warbled voices filled the space around me. The air here was thick, almost viscous, and the shadows seemed to press close, pooling in corners and stretching tendrils toward me. I closed my eyes, seeking focus. The choir's hymn swirled, voices bending and twisting with unnatural elasticity. I felt the ground tilt, a wave of vertigo washing over me as the melody wrapped itself around my mind. The notes were no longer just sound. They were tendrils probing into the depths of my soul, tugging at memories long buried and fears best left forgotten. A sudden distortion sliced through the harmony, a high, keening scream buried beneath the layers of sound. My breath caught. The shadows flickered violently, and for a moment I glimpsed shapes within them, faces contorted with silent agony, mouths moving in mute pleadings. I staggered back, clutching the rough stone railing, my heart pounding a frantic tattoo. The cathedral seemed to pulse the choir's voices, a living heartbeat, drawing me closer and closer to a precipice I could neither see nor resist. Behind me, a harsh voice cut through the haze. "You were losing yourself," Elias said, his tone edged with both concern and frustration. He stepped into the loft, his scarred face set in a grim line. "This isn't just some song, it's a trap." I swallowed hard, struggling to find words that could bridge the widening gulf between fear and hope. Mara's soft prayers drifted upward from below, fragile threads of faith woven into the thickening darkness. Caleb's skeptical glare burned into me, a reminder that not all believed salvation lay within these walls. "Is it divine grace or a snare?" Elias asked, stepping closer. "Do you hear the choir, or are you hearing your own madness?" I looked into his eyes, searching for certainty where there was none. "I don't know," I admitted. But the shadows, they were not just tricks of light. They move with the music, shifting like living things. The choir's power isn't just sound, it's something that reaches into us, changing what we see, what we feel. Sister Agnes appeared at the loft's entrance, her aged face etched with worry. "There's a prophecy," she murmured, voice trembling as the shadows flickered behind her like restless spirits. The choir's hymn resonates with the very soul of the world, bending the resonance of life and death. It calls to those who listen, promising salvation. But at a cost beyond reckoning. Her words hung in the air, heavy and resolute. The choir's song rose again, swelling in intensity, weaving a sonic web that threatened to ensnare us all. I could feel the fragile bonds between the survivors fraying, the trust we had fought to preserve unraveling thread by thread. As the hymn reached its crescendo, I clutched my journal, fingers trembling. The shadows danced, the voices beckoned, and I knew that tonight, the line between salvation and damnation would be tested as never before. The choir's embrace was tightening, and none of us could say what awaited beyond its haunting melody. But I would try to understand. I had to. Because to surrender was to disappear into the endless night, and I was not yet ready to vanish. The weight of silence pressed heavily upon me as I sat beneath the fractured stained glass window. The shattered shards of colored glass, remnants of a world long lost, scattered fractured light across the cold stone floor and my gaunt face. The hues once vibrant blues and reds now blurred into one another, ghostly and fragile as the memories that clawed their way through the shadowed recesses of my mind. Each broken pane seemed to sing its own mournful hymn, a fractured echo of a time when faith was not a desperate anchor, but a quiet certainty. I closed my eyes, and the cathedral dissolved around me. I was no longer among the ruined stones, but back in the warmth of a long-lost home. My wife's laughter, soft and bright, danced in the air. Our children's voices, innocent and full of life, filled the rooms with light. But the visions were cruel illusions. The world had shattered, and they were gone, taken by the relentless apocalypse that swallowed all we held dear. Guilt coiled in my chest, a serpent tightening its grip. I had promised to protect them, and yet I had failed. A tremor of cold air brushed my skin, pulling me from reverie. Sister Agnes's quiet footsteps approached, soft against the debris-strewn floor. Her face, worn by years and shadowed by sorrow, held a quiet strength that I envied. Her eyes met mine, offering a balm I scarcely deserved. "We carry burdens we cannot lay down," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread weaving through the silence. Faith is not the absence of doubt, but the courage to hold on despite it. Her words settled around me like a shroud, both comforting and suffocating. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. The choir's distant hymns drifted through the arches, ethereal, haunting, and relentless. They seemed to seep into my very bones, stirring something primal within me. I reached for my journal, the worn leather cover cool beneath my trembling hands. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows, dancing wildly as I wrote. Each stroke of the pen was a release, a desperate attempt to capture fleeting thoughts before they slipped away into the void. Memories spilled onto the pages, fragments of hope, shards of despair, the silent screams of a soul torn between faith and fear. Outside, the choir's melody swelled, a sudden sharp note slicing through the stillness like a blade. My breath caught, heart pounding in my chest. The shadows along the cathedral walls seemed to writhe and pulse, alive with a dark energy that both beckoned and repelled. My eyes snapped open, burning with a fierce determination. No longer could I afford the luxury of despair. The survivors depended on me, not just to lead them through the ruins, but to shield them from the choir's insidious embrace. I would uncover its secrets, no matter the cost. With a steadying breath, I rose, the fragile light of dawn whispering through the broken windows. The burden of memory pressed heavy against my soul, but beneath it, a spark of stubborn hope flickered. The choir's hymn was far from over, and so was my fight. In this cathedral of shadows and shattered faith, I would stand as a sentinel, guarding the fragile line between salvation and oblivion. The past haunted me, but it would not break me. Tonight, I would listen and prepare. The choir's song continued, and I would follow its dark melody to the very end, seeking truth in the silence that followed. The cathedral was quieter than usual that evening, but not in a way that brought comfort. The hush was thick, a taut stillness stretched tight over cracked stone and shattered pews, as if the ruins themselves were holding their breath. I stood near the altar's remains, the flicker of a lone candle casting trembling shadows across my journal's yellowed pages. My pen moved hurriedly, scrawling thoughts too fragmented for coherent speech notes on the choir, the fractures in our group, and the ever-tightening grip of the unseen voice that sang to us each night. Outside the fragile circle of candlelight, tension simmered dangerously. Elias's silhouette was rigid and unyielding, his broad frame a stark contrast to Caleb's lean, restless form. They stood facing each other, voices low but sharp, each word a spark threatening to ignite the dry tinder of our fragile peace. "You don't see what's happening," Elias said, his voice rough from too many sleepless nights. "This choir, it's not salvation, it's a trap. We can't afford to pretend otherwise." Caleb's eyes glinted with defiance, his brow furrowed in disbelief. "And what do you suggest?" "We turn our backs on the only light we have left. You re too quick to judge, Elias. Maybe you re just afraid to have faith. The words hung between them, heavy and accusatory. Around us, the others shifted uneasily, caught between loyalty and fear. Mara sat apart, her slender frame hunched over a tattered hymn book, lips moving in silent prayer. Her pale, haunting eyes reflected a fragile hope that seemed both a balm and a curse to this fractured group. I stepped forward, voice steady though my heart raced. Enough. This bickering will tear us apart faster than the choir ever could. We need to find a way to hold together. We have to. But even as I spoke, I knew the choir's melodies were seeping deeper into our minds, weaving doubt and desire, terror and hope into a tangled web that no argument could easily unravel. Mara looked up then, her voice soft but resolute. The choir is our salvation. It sings of peace beyond this broken world. You both forget what it has given us, the hope to carry on, the promise of something more. Elias's eyes darkened. Hope without reason is a dangerous thing. We need to face reality, not illusions. Caleb snorted. Reality's a nightmare, Elias. Maybe the chore's nightmare is better. A bitter silence fell before I raised my hands. We all want to survive, but survival means trust between us, between faith and reason. We cannot let the choir divide us further. The choir's hymn began then, a slow, haunting swell that reverberated through the broken arches and shattered stained glass. The disembodied voices rose in a spectral harmony that wrapped around us like a suffocating shroud. It silenced all speech, drawing us into its eerie embrace. I felt it then, the invisible threads tightening, pulling at the edges of my mind and soul. Fear mingled with a strange allure, a promise whispered in ancient melodies that stirred memories long buried. I blinked against the candlelight, my journal slipping from trembling fingers. Could I hold on to reason amid such seductive darkness? As the final notes faded, the group remained frozen, some eyes glazed with reverence, others narrowed in suspicion. Mara's whispered prayers continued, fragile yet unyielding. Elias's jaw clenched, Caleb's restless gaze darted about. I swallowed hard. The choir's hold was growing stronger, and so were the cracks between us. We needed each other now more than ever. But the question lingered in the cold air. How long before the choir's song tore us apart entirely? I closed my journal with a sigh, the weight of leadership pressing down like the cathedral's crumbling vaults. Tomorrow night, the choir would sing again, and we would have to face the choices it forced upon us between faith and fear, unity and fracture, salvation and loss. The night stretched on, heavy with unspoken dread. Somewhere deep within the shattered stones, the choir waited, its eternal hymn winding tighter around all of us, promising both salvation and oblivion. The descent into the hidden chamber was no longer a venture of mere curiosity. It had become a pilgrimage into the heart of the cathedral's darkest secrets. As I stepped down the worn stone steps, the air grew heavier, laden with the scent of ancient dust and something less definable, an undercurrent of something both sacred and profane. The flickering light of my lantern cast long shadows that danced across the walls, revealing the faint outlines of carvings long eroded by time, yet still hauntingly vivid. Elias remained at the entrance, his silhouette a rigid sentinel against the encroaching darkness. His eyes, sharp and wary, flicked constantly toward the faint hum that threaded its way from the cathedral above the choir's hymn, a spectral melody that insinuated itself into every crevice of the ruined world. His grip on the rusted pipe tightened, knuckles whitening. A silent testament to the tension had become our constant companion. I moved deeper into the chamber, my boots stirring loose dust that twirled like ghostly motes in the lantern's glow. The walls here were lined with relics, fragments of a forgotten faith, their surfaces etched with symbols that pulsed faintly with an eerie light. I reached out, fingers trembling, to brush against a carved tablet depicting figures suspended in a liminal space between light and shadow. Their faces were obscured, yet there was a familiarity that stirred something deep within me, a memory perhaps, or a warning. Nearby, Sister Agnes sat cross-legged on the cold stone floor, her fragile frame hunched over a collection of ancient scrolls. Her trembling fingers traced the faded script, lips moving silently as if in prayer or invocation. I watched her, sensing the storm of emotions beneath her composed exterior: grief, revelation, and a dawning despair that mirrored my own. These texts, she whispered, eyes lifting to meet mine, speak of a celestial order, once radiant and pure, now fallen. Cast down for reasons lost to time, but their echoes remain trapped here, bound to this place and this choir. My heart pounded. The choir was no mere spectral phenomenon. It was a remnant, perhaps a curse, of something divine and terrible. The hymns we so desperately clung to were threads woven from both hope and doom. As I examined another relic, a twisted crown wrought of dark metal and shattered gems, I felt the choir's presence swell, its voices threading through the chamber like tendrils of smoke. The paradox was undeniable. This entity was both destroyer and redeemer, luring souls with promises of salvation while consuming them in its eternal song. Elias's voice cut through my reverie. We can't keep chasing shadows. This thing, whatever it is, it's tearing us apart from the inside. I nodded, understanding the truth in his words, yet unable to relinquish the fragile hope that knowledge might grant us some leverage against the darkness. We must know, I replied quietly. To fight or to surrender, we need to understand what we face. The chamber seemed to close in around us, the weight of centuries pressing down as the choir's hymn rose, a haunting chorus that filled the air with both beauty and menace. I felt the pull again, the seductive embrace of the eternal hymn, and fought to anchor myself in the stark reality before me. This chamber held answers, but also questions that cut deeper than any blade. The choir entity was no simple demon or angel. It was the embodiment of apocalypse itself, a twisted synthesis of salvation and annihilation. And as the shadows shifted and the relics whispered their secrets, I knew our struggle was far from over. Outside, the cathedral groaned under the weight of the night, the survivors clinging to their fragile bonds. Inside, I faced the abyss, one step closer to the truth, one step closer to the choir's dark salvation. The final note of the hymn faded, leaving a silence so profound it echoed within my very bones. And in that silence, a question burned brighter than any light. How much were we willing to sacrifice to survive, and at what cost would salvation come? The chamber waited, its secrets poised to unravel the fragile thread between faith and despair. And I, wary and resolute, prepared to delve deeper into the choir's eternal song. The cathedral was alive with sound and unnatural, swelling chorus that seemed to surge from the very stones beneath our feet. The choir's hymn rose, a wave of ethereal voices that twisted and turned through the vaulted space, pressing against my eardrums like a living force. I felt it crawling beneath my skin, a vibration that burrowed deeper than muscle or bone, tugging at the edges of my mind. Around me, others shuddered, clutching at their heads or trembling in place, caught in the choir's sonic snare.
"Hold steady!"
Elias barked, his voice slicing through the din. He moved among the gathered survivors, his hands firm on shoulders, his eyes scanning for signs of faltering will.
"Focus on me! Don't listen to it!"
His commands were desperate lifelines thrown across a sea of madness. I gritted my teeth, pressing my palms hard against my temples, willing the intrusive melodies to loosen their grip. The choir's voices were no longer soothing hymns but claws, raking at fragile thoughts and twisted memories. I caught fleeting whispers, snatches of forgotten prayers, half-heard confessions, and promises of salvation. Yet beneath it all lurked something darker, a ceaseless call, an endless song that promised to claim us all. Caleb's figure appeared at the edge of my vision, his mouth moving in defiant shouts that fought to pierce the overwhelming sound.
"This isn't salvation!"
he screamed, voice ragged but fierce. "It's a trap!"
"Break free!"
His words faltered against the choir's crescendo, yet planted a seed of resistance in the swirling chaos. Sister Agnes knelt nearby, hands folded tightly in prayer. Her voice trembled as she intoned ancient words, weaving a fragile shield of faith against the encroaching darkness. Her presence was a beacon, faint but vital, anchoring the others to a thread of hope in the suffocating gloom. The cathedral's broken stained glass cast fractured light across the stone floor, flickering like dying embers as shadows danced with the rising hymn. I could see Mara's empty spot in the circle, a ghostly reminder of the hymn's true cost. Each vanished soul an echo of the choir's promise, a price paid in silence. My journal was clutched tightly in my freehand pages, filled with desperate scribbles, theories, and prayers. I knew the choir was neither wholly divine nor utterly malevolent, but a cruel duality that fed on our faith and fear alike. Tonight, that duality threatened to consume us. We must resist, I whispered to myself, voice raw but resolute. Hold on to what's left of our minds. Hold on to each other. The choir's voices swelled again, a tidal wave of sound that sought to drown us, but amidst the chaos, I caught Elias's steady grip on my arm. Caleb's shouted defiance and Sister Agnes's fragile prayer. We were fragile, broken, but not yet lost. As the hymn reached its fever pitch, the cathedral trembled not just from sound, but from the weight of choices yet to come. Would we surrender to the eternal song, or fight for a future beyond its haunting embrace? I raised my voice, joining the cacophony with a desperate cry that was neither prayer nor plea but a vow. I would not let the choir claim us all. Not tonight. The night stretched on, endless and unyielding, and as the final notes faded into an uneasy silence, I knew the battle for our souls was far from over. But for now, we had survived the song of desperation, clinging to the fragile hope that still flickered in the ruins of faith and apocalypse. The choir's hymn had drawn close to the edge of oblivion, and so had we. What awaited beyond the silence was a question that burned brighter than any melody, one I was determined to face, no matter the cost. And so beneath the shattered vaults of the ruined cathedral, with the choir's echoes still lingering like ghosts in the shadows, I prepared for what came next. The final verse of this dreadful symphony was yet to be written, and I would be its reluctant author. The night was far from over. The cathedral was heavy with the weight of expectation, the air thick with the scent of smoke and damp stone. Flickering candlelight cast long, wavering shadows across the cracked pews and shattered stained glass, fragments of color bleeding like wounds into the gloom. We had gathered once more beneath the fractured vaults, the survivors, all of us, each face etched with exhaustion, fear, and the fragile thread of hope that the choir's haunting hymn had spun around our souls. The distant melody drifted through the broken arches like a siren's call, its ethereal voices weaving through the cold air, pure and terrible. It was a sound unlike any other, at once comforting and alien, a promise whispered in tones both sweet and sinister. The choir sang to us, and we listened, tethered to a fragile hope that salvation still lingered somewhere amidst the ruins. I stood near the altar, my journal clutched tightly in one hand, the other trembling slightly as I brushed a stray lock of hair from my face. My gaunt features caught the candlelight, eyes reflecting the fatigue that had settled deep within me, yet burning with a fierce determination. Around me the survivors murmured, voices low and cautious, as if speaking too loudly might fracture the fragile peace. Elias's voice cut through the murmurs like a blade, rough and urgent. "We cannot stay here, not like this. The choir's call is a trap, a snare dressed in light. Every time it sings, one of us disappears. We know the cost. We can't keep waiting for salvation that steals our souls." Mara's pale face crumpled with tears, her slender fingers clutching a worn cloth at her chest. "But it's the only hope left," she whispered, voice trembling but resolute. "The choir promises us peace, salvation beyond this broken world. We have to believe, or what's left of us will wither away." Caleb's sharp eyes flicked between them, skepticism etched into every line of his restless frame. Belief without evidence is a death sentence. We were clinging to ghosts while the real world decays outside these walls. Jonas's news about other survivors, other groups, shows there's life beyond this cathedral. If we stay, we die here. If we leave, maybe we live. The council had gathered to face this impossible crossroads. Sister Agnes sat quietly, her serene yet troubled gaze drifting between us, the weight of ancient wisdom and fractured faith heavy in her presence. The air buzzed with tension, the choir's hymn swelling, threading through the vaults, wrapping around us like a shroud. I raised my voice, steady despite the turmoil clawing at my chest. We must decide tonight. To heed the choir's call means risking the same fate as those who vanished before us. But to reject it is to step into an uncertain wilderness with dangers we cannot predict. Our faith is tested, not just in the choir but in each other and in ourselves. A silence fell, thick and suffocating, broken only by the choir's haunting melody and the distant howl of the wind outside. Jonas's earlier report echoed in my mind signs of other survivors, shadows moving beyond the ruins, a flicker of life in the desolation. Could we trust that hope, or was it another illusion like the choir's hymn? The group fractured before my eyes. Some clung to Mara's faith, drawn like moths to the choir's light, willing to risk disappearance for the promise of peace. Others, led by Elias and Caleb, bristled with defiance, their pragmatism a shield against despair. As the hymn reached a crescendo, the shadows cast by candlelight twisted and danced along the ancient stone, as if the cathedral itself breathed with the choir's will. I felt the crushing weight of choice pressing down on my soul between surrender and resistance, salvation and survival. I searched the faces before me, each marked by loss and longing. Their fates rested on my words, my courage. The night stretched ahead, uncertain and dark, a crossroads where faith and fear collided. And as the final notes of the choir's song faded into silence, I knew the path we chose would change us all forever. But which path was the true salvation? And who, in the end, would be left to tell the tale? The cathedral held its breath, waiting for our answer. The cathedral's shattered vaults stretched above us like fractured ribs of some colossal, long-dead beast. Moonlight spilled through the broken stained glass, scattering fragmented colors across the cold stone floor. Flickering candles, their flames trembling in the stale air, cast dancing shadows that seemed to breathe with a life of their own. We gathered once more, the ragged remnants of humanity drawn together by the haunting summons of a choir that promised salvation and whispered doom in equal measure. I stood at the edge of the group, my eyes tracing the familiar faces etched with exhaustion and fear. Elias, his scarred hands clenched tightly around the haft of his makeshift spear, scanned the darkness beyond the cathedral's crumbled walls. Mara's absence left a hollow ache, the memory of her pale, haunted eyes lingering like a ghost that refused to rest. Jonas shifted nervously beside Sister Agnes, whose gnarled hands folded tightly in her lap, her ancient eyes betraying a storm of conflicting emotions. Caleb paced restlessly, his sharp gaze flickering between us all, as if searching for a crack in our fragile armor. The air was thick with unspoken tensions. Tonight was different. Tonight the choir would sing its final hymn, the one we had dreaded and yet hoped for in equal measure. The final vigil. As the first notes slipped from some unseen source, the cathedral seemed to inhale a deep, resonant breath that shook the dust from the rafters. The choir's voices rolled out in waves of ethereal sound, a tapestry woven from threads of sorrow, longing, and something indescribably ancient. The melody seeped into our bones, a haunting hymn that promised both redemption and oblivion. I watched as some of the survivors closed their eyes, lips moving in silent prayer, while others clenched their fists, teeth gritted against the rising tide of dread. Elias's jaw tightened. He never fully trusted the choir, but even he could not deny the power it wielded over us all. Sister Agnes murmured a litany beneath her breath, her voice barely audible over the swelling chorus. The stained glass above flickered in the shifting candlelight, casting spectral shapes that seemed to sway in time with the music. Shadows lengthened and twisted, creeping along the walls like living things. I felt the familiar pull the choir's song winding its way into the deepest corners of my mind, stirring memories of faith, loss, and the fragile hope that had carried me this far. "Do you feel it?" I whispered to Elias, my voice trembling despite myself. He nodded grimly. "It's like it's reaching inside us, trying to take something." My eyes darted around the circle. Faces were pale, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and reverence. Mara's absence was a gaping wound, a reminder of the price we all risked paying. The Choir's voices rose to a chilling crescendo, the sound both beautiful and terrible. It wrapped around us like a shroud, binding our souls in a sonic embrace that threatened to unravel the tenuous threads of our reality. I could feel my heartbeat quicken, a primal terror mingling with a desperate yearning for the salvation the choir promised. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the cathedral, the sound of stone shifting, or perhaps something far less tangible. The candles flickered violently, casting wild, leaping shadows that danced like specters. A cold wind whispered through the ruins, carrying with it a faint, sorrowful wail that sent a shiver down my spine. Elias tightened his grip on his spear. "We need to be ready," he muttered. Sister Agnes's eyes met mine, filled with a wary understanding. This is the moment. We face what lies beneath the hymn. The Choir's melody softened, becoming a lullaby of fractured hopes and broken dreams. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every lost soul, every vanished listener, hanging heavy in the air. The survivors looked to me, skeptics and believers alike, waiting for a sign, a plan, a shred of certainty in a world that had none. I stepped forward, voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "We stand together. Whatever comes, we hold on to each other. This is our vigil, our defiance against the silence that wants to claim us." A murmur of assent rippled through the group. Caleb's restless pacing ceased, Jonas's youthful gaze steadied, and even Elias nodded, the protector's resolve hardening. The choir's final notes faded into an uneasy silence, broken only by the faint drip of water somewhere deep within the cathedral's bowels. The shadows seemed to hold their breath, waiting. In that fragile stillness, I felt the weight of what was to come, the ultimate confrontation with the entity that had bound us in this spectral prison of sound. Faith and fear twisted together in a tight knot within my chest. As the first stars blinked cold and distant above the ruined spires, I knew there was no turning back. The last vigil had begun, and with it, the final reckoning. The Choir's hymn had summoned us here one last time. Now we would see what salvation or damnation truly awaited. The cathedral held its breath, and so did we. The cathedral groaned beneath the weight of silence, an oppressive stillness that stretched taut like a held breath. Shadows flickered and danced along the fractured, stained glass, casting eerie fragments of color that fluttered like dying butterflies across the cracked stone floor. I stood alone in the nave, the vast emptiness swallowing my footsteps as the first faint notes of the choir's hymn began to weave through the air, once more ethereal, haunting, impossibly beautiful. The voices seeped into my skin, a symphony without source, wrapping around my mind and soul like a velvet shroud. There was no light here, save for the pale moon filtering through broken windows, but the sound summoned visions that blazed behind my eyes, endless stars collapsing, skies burning with silent fire, and countless faces lost to the void. The choir was not merely song, it was a presence, a living echo of all that had been shattered. "You have come," the voices whispered, simultaneously a caress and a claw. "You seek the truth beyond salvation and despair." I swallowed hard, trying to steal my breath. "Why? What do you want from us? From me?" The choir shifted, a chorus of shadows flickering at the edges of perception. "We offer release, a passage through the final darkness. You may join the eternal hymn, or resist and remain tethered to mortal suffering." My resolve wavered. The promise of peace was intoxicating, a balm to the ragged fractures of hope left in the ruins. Mara's face floated before me, pale and resolute, her faith an ember I had once envied and now mourned. She had vanished into this very embrace, swallowed by promises I half wished to believe. From the nave's periphery, Elias's heavy footsteps echoed, steady as a heartbeat. His eyes bore into me, fierce and wary. "Don't listen to it," he drawled. It's a trap, a snare. We lose ourselves one by one if we give it any quarter. I met his gaze, the weight of leadership pressing down like the cathedral's broken vaults. But what if it's the only way? What if rejecting it means death too? Elias's jaw tightened. Then we fight. We don't surrender to ghosts and lies. The Chor's voices swelled, a rising tide of sound that filled every crack and crevice, blurring the line between reality and nightmare. I felt my knees weaken as the entity's power pressed against my soul, tugging at the threads of doubt and despair woven within me. In that moment, the cathedral was no longer a ruin, but a crucible where faith and fear collided in a violent dance. Choose, the choir breathed, the words echoing through the bones of the building. Embrace the hymn and be free, or deny and remain in torment. I closed my eyes, memories flooding. Mara's voice lifted in song, Elias's protective scowl, Sister Agnes's cryptic warnings, Jonas's hopeful reports of a world beyond these shattered walls. The cost of salvation was clear. Each note carried a soul away, a price too steep to bear without shattering what remained of our fragile humanity. With a trembling hand, I reached deep within, grasping the remnants of my former faith and the stubborn ember of hope that refused to be snuffed out. No, I whispered, voice barely a breath. I will not surrender to your hollow salvation. The choir's hymn fractured, discordant and wild, a tempest of sound that threatened to tear the very air apart. Shadows writhed and flared, a storm of voices crying out in a language older than time. Then, abruptly, the cathedral fell silent. Elias stepped forward, eyes wide but resolute. You did it. I nodded, though my heart pounded with the knowledge that this was no victory, merely a pause. The Chor's embrace had been resisted, but its shadow lingered like a scar etched into the soul of the place. We live, I said softly, but at what cost? Outside, the first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting long fingers of gold through the broken windows. The ruined cathedral stood silent but alive, a monument to faith's fragile endurance amid ruin. And I, battered but unbroken, prepared to lead the survivors through whatever darkness still waited beyond the fading hymn. The choice had been made, but the story was far from over. The cathedral, once alive with the haunting chorus that had both comforted and terrorized us, now lay in a profound silence that pressed down upon every shattered stone and broken pew. The air, thick with dust and memories, held no warmth, only the cold aftermath of what we had endured. We gathered in the nave, a fractured congregation of souls, each face a map of exhaustion, grief, and something else, something raw and fragile that might be hope. I watched as Elias stood apart, his broad frame tense, hands clenched at his sides, his eyes scanning the shadows where the choir's voices had last danced. Across from him, Caleb's restless gaze flickered with doubt and anger, the furrows in his brow deepening with every breath. Between them hung the unspoken question that now defined us all: what comes next? I found myself retreating to the edges, where the relics of the cathedral's lost grandeur lay scattered like forgotten prayers. My fingers traced the worn covers of my journal, the pages heavy with hurried notes, desperate questions, and fleeting moments of clarity. The choir's final hymn echoed faintly in my mind, a melody both beautiful and terrible, a siren song that had drawn us to the brink. Now, with that song silenced, the weight of its costs settled over me like a shroud. Mara's absence lingered like a wound that refused to close, a reminder that salvation was never free. I sat alone, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows that seemed to whisper secrets only I could hear. Near the shattered altar, Elias and Caleb's low voices broke the silence, their words sharp but restrained. They argued not with hatred, but with the desperation of men grasping for meaning in ruins. Elias, ever the protector, spoke of rebuilding, of forging a new order from the ashes, even if that order was fragile and uncertain. Caleb countered with skepticism, warning against blind faith in shadows and echoes. Their clash revealed the fracture within our fragile community, a fissure between those who sought to cling to the choir's promise and those who feared it had been a cruel delusion. From the dim corners of the nave, Sister Agnes moved with slow, deliberate steps, lighting a candle whose flame flickered against the encroaching gloom. Her voice, though soft, carried across the hollow space as she spoke of forgiveness not just of others, but of ourselves. She spoke of the uncertain path ahead, a road without the choir's guiding hymn, where faith would no longer be a comfort but a question. Her words, fragile as the flame she guarded, offered a tentative bridge between despair and hope. As night deepened around us, the silence of the cathedral became a mirror reflecting our own inner voids. The choir's absence was a wound, and a salve a terrifying end and a necessary beginning. We were left to pick up the pieces, to find meaning in the echoes that lingered, to decide if faith was a lifeline or a chain. And in that silence I felt the weight of all we had lost and all we might still become. The cathedral stood silent, yet alive with memory, a monument not just to what had been destroyed, but to the fragile endurance of faith amid ruin. Outside, the world remained broken, but within these walls we faced the quiet aftermath. And as the first light of dawn pierced the fractured stained glass, I knew our story was far from over. The choir's song had ended, but our journey was only beginning. Dawn broke over the cathedral ruins with an unusual softness, the pale light spilling through the fractured stained glass and casting fractured rainbows onto the cracked stone floor. I stood near the shattered west doors, the chill of morning wrapping around me like a shroud, when Jonas appeared. His figure, slender and nimble despite the weariness etched deep beneath his eyes, emerged from the haze of dust and ruin. In his hands, he carried a battered satchel bulging with scraps of evidence from beyond the cathedral's confines, a few dried leaves, a crude map sketched hastily on torn parchment, and a small pouch of seeds, their presence almost miraculous. "You won't believe what I found," Jonas said, voice low but trembling with excitement. "There are others out there, places where the earth still breathes and life claws its way back." The words hung in the cold air like a fragile promise. For so long, the choir's haunting hymns had been both our sanctuary and our prison, its melodies a bittersweet lullaby that soothed yet ensnared our souls. To hear of green shoots piercing the cracked earth beyond these walls was a revelation that stirred something long dormant within us. We gathered in the nave, the skeletal remains of pews and altar stones our only furniture. The fire we lit was modest, its flames crackling against the silence that had settled over us like a thick fog. One by one, survivors leaned in as Jonas unfolded his map, tracing routes with a trembling finger. The soft crackle of the fire mingled with the distant echoes of the choir's fading hymn, a reminder of the ever-present tension between hope and dread. Elias, ever the pragmatist, was the first to voice the question on all our minds: are these places safe, or just more traps waiting to be sprung? Jonas shrugged, a flicker of a smile breaking through his fatigue. "Safe? No, but alive, and that's more than we've dared hope for." Murmurs rippled through the group. Mara's absence weighed heavily on us all, a ghostly presence in the shadows. Yet tonight, her memory seemed to fuel a different kind of fire, one not of despair, but of cautious possibility. As the night deepened, I found myself alone with the map, candlelight flickering against the ancient stone pillars that held the cathedral's story. My fingers traced the lines and markings, each a potential path away from the choir's oppressive embrace. But shadows danced on the walls, whispering of the entity's lingering power, a reminder that escape might demand sacrifices we were not yet prepared to pay. Elias took his post at the threshold, his silhouette framed by the dying light. His eyes scanned the horizon, where the darkness of the ruins met the faint glow of dawn, a boundary between the known and the unknown. His presence was a steadfast anchor, a silent vow that we would face whatever came together. In that moment, I realized that the choir's hymn was no longer the only song we could hear. Beneath the ruins and echoes, a new melody was stirring, a fragile, tentative refrain of resilience and renewal. The question was whether we had the courage to follow it beyond the cathedral's shattered walls. The fire flickered lower, and with it, the night's shadows retreated. Tomorrow we would decide our next steps. For now, we held on to the fragments of hope Jonas had brought, fragile as they were, like the first green shoots after a long winter, promising that even in the apocalypse, life finds a way. But as I lay down to rest, the distant echo of a choir hymn whispered through the stones, a haunting reminder that salvation's price was never truly known. The path ahead was uncertain, and the choice to walk it would test the very core of our faith and will. And so, within the cathedral's hollowed bones, the survivors stirred not just in fear, but in the fragile light of hope, ready to face the dawn of whatever came next. The cathedral was quiet now, but the silence was not peace. It was a fragile veil stretched thin over memories that refused to fade. Night after night, the echoes of the choir's hymns drifted through the cracked stone walls, a spectral resonance that clung to the air like a mournful breath. I sat alone beneath the shattered rose window, its fractured glass casting shards of colored light across my journal. The pages were heavy with words, thoughts, and fears, fragments of hope and despair woven into a tapestry of ink. Outside, the wind whispered through the ruins, carrying with it the faintest trace of melody. It was as if the choir's voices, though long silenced, had seeped into the very bones of the cathedral, trapped in an endless refrain that refused to let us go. I traced the letters of my last entry, pausing to listen. The faintest hum stirred in the distance, a reminder that the choir's song lingered still, stubborn and elusive. Jonas burst through the cracked doors, breathless, his eyes wide with a mix of excitement and dread. "I heard something," he whispered, voice trembling. Far beyond the ruins there was a faint singing, like the choir, but distant. His words sent a shiver through me. The outside world had always been a place of shadows and danger, but the possibility of others of faint echoes beyond our shattered sanctuary ignited a spark of restless hope. Yet with that hope came fear. What if the choir's haunting melody had spread, a siren call drawing more souls into its eternal hymn? Later, Sister Agnes gathered the survivors in the nave, her frail voice rising in prayer. The candlelight flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the cracked stone pillars. Hands clasped tightly, we sought comfort in the familiar rhythm of ancient rites, clinging to the fragile threads of faith that had carried us this far. Her words were a balm, yet beneath them lay an undercurrent of uncertainty, a shared recognition that salvation was no longer a certainty, but a question lingering in every breath. Elias stood apart, his silhouette framed by the fractured stained glass. His eyes, hardened by loss and survival, scanned the empty night with a vigilance born of too many vanished comrades. The choir's song had taken much from us friends, faith, and fragments of sanity. Yet he remained a steadfast guardian against the encroaching darkness, a bulwark against despair. As I penned the last lines of my journal, I realized that the choir's hymn had become more than a sound, it was a presence, a force that shaped our reality and our souls. It was neither wholly cruel nor kind, but a haunting enigma that mirrored the fragile balance we lived within, between hope and fear, faith and doubt, salvation and loss. The cathedral stood silent but alive, a monument to a world undone and the fragile endurance of belief. The echoes lingered, carried on the wind, and etched into the shadows, a reminder that some songs never truly end, they simply wait, haunting the spaces between memory and oblivion. And as I closed my journal, the faintest note of a hymn brushed my ear, a whisper from the choir, a call unanswered, a question left hanging in the silence. What comes next, I wondered, when the echoes finally fade? The answer lay somewhere beyond the ruins, waiting in the dark. But for now, we remain bound by sound, by memory, by the fragile hope that one last song might yet bring us peace. The first light of dawn crept slowly through the fractured stained glass windows of the ruined cathedral, spilling fractured ribbons of color across the cold, cracked stone floor. The vast, cavernous space was silent, now no longer filled with the disembodied choir that had haunted our nights and stolen our numbers. A fragile hush lay over the bones of this once sacred place, yet beneath that silence, I could feel the faint pulse of something undying, a lingering breath that whispered of the past and hinted at a future still veiled in uncertainty. I sat alone in the nave, my back resting against the rough-hewn pew, the tattered journal open on my lap. My fingers trembled slightly as I turned a page and began to write. The words came slowly, weighted with the memories of all we had endured. The Choir's hymns, once a beacon of hope, had become a siren call, a promise of salvation that demanded a terrible toll. Each vanished friend, each empty space where a soul had been drawn into that eternal hymn, haunted my thoughts like ghosts refusing to rest. Outside, the wind whispered through the broken arches, stirring dust motes that danced in the pale light. The desolation beyond the cathedral's walls was absolute, yet carried with it the faintest murmur of life, the distant rustle of leaves, the tentative cry of a bird, the soft footsteps of a scout returning with news. Jonas had brought reports of survivors beyond the ruins, their signs a fragile thread connecting us to a world that might still endure. It was hope, subtle and uncertain, threading its way through the oppressive weight of loss and fear. Elias moved quietly through the shadows near the altar, his scarred hands resting on the cold stone, eyes scanning the empty expanse with a wary vigilance that had never left him. He was still the protector, though his battles now seemed less with the outside dangers and more with the ghosts inside each of us. His practical nature clashed often with my lingering faith, yet in this moment of fragile peace, there was a shared understanding that survival was no longer just about bodies, but about the endurance of spirit. Sister Agan sat nearby, her frail figure hunched beneath a threadbare shawl. Her eyes, clouded with age yet sharp with wisdom, reflected the long struggle to reconcile the Choir's ambiguous nature. She had once whispered of fallen celestial orders and the thin line between salvation and damnation. Now, in the silence, her presence was a quiet testament to faith's fragility, a beacon flickering against the coming dark. I wrote of the Choir not as a force simply of evil or grace, but as something more complex, a symphony of despair and hope intertwined, a reflection of humanity's own fractured soul. The apocalypse had come not only in fire and ruin, but in the very sound that had filled this cathedral night after night. The Choir's hymn was both a wound and a balm, a call to salvation and an eternal trap. The cost of that salvation was etched into every vanished face, every silent space left behind by those who listened too deeply. Yet even as I wrote, the faintest echoes of the Choir's melody seemed to drift through the air around me, no longer harsh or menacing, but hauntingly beautiful and achingly tender. The voices wove through the shadows, a lingering hymn that spoke of loss and longing, of an apocalypse not just outside these walls, but within each of us. It was a reminder that some part of the world's soul endured, even in ruin. I looked up, eyes tracing the cathedral's shattered vaults, reaching toward the pale sky. This place, scarred and broken, was a monument to faith's endurance, fragile, battered, yet still standing. The survivors who remained were scattered and weary, their hearts heavy with grief and uncertain hope. Yet they were here, and in this presence there was a quiet defiance against the silence that sought to claim us all. The last song the Choir sang was not an ending, but a beginning, a fragile thread binding us to the possibility of something beyond despair. I closed my journal gently, the weight of the past settling like dust around me. Tomorrow, and the days after, would be uncertain. We would face the shadows and the silence, the fear and the faint hope, but we would endure. For the world outside was broken, yes, but the world within the world of memory, faith, and the fragile music of the soul still breathed. And as long as that song lingered, no matter how faint, there was a reason to listen, to hope, and to keep walking forward into the unknown. The cathedral stood silent but alive, and so did we. I rose slowly, the echoes of the last hymn fading into the morning light, carrying with them a promise not of easy salvation, but of survival, of faith hammered and tempered in fire, and of a song that would never fully die. Our last song had been sung, yet somehow the music endured,